Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be close reading and analysing Alexander Pope's marvellous tour de force poem called The Rape of the Lock. I'm going to be thinking about the poem's mock epic form as it relates to ideas about scale, and I'm going to look very briefly at the history of the microscope and its relevance to Pope's poem. And then I'm going to consider how Pope plays with ideas of scale technically and grammatically through his use of antithesis and zeugma. And don't worry if you're not familiar with the terms antithesis and zeugma, they're grammatical literary techniques that I will explain and that Pope really was a master of. Remember, if you like what I do here, then like this video and subscribe to my channel. Subscribing means that you'll see my new weekly videos when they're posted, and it really does help me out in YouTube's algorithm. I want to start today by quoting William Hazlitt, a Romantic period literary critic, perhaps even the premier literary critic of the Romantic period. And he was not always terribly complimentary about Pope, which is why this might seem like a bit of an odd place for me to start. But despite the fact that he was very critical of Pope elsewhere, Hazlitt wrote in 1818, "The Rape of the Lock is the best or most ingenious of these. It is the perfection of the mock heroic." And the mock heroic is another term for the mock epic genre. So Pope then, according to Hazlitt, had perfected the mock epic form, and clearly that's a very, very strong word to use, perfected the form. So The Rape of the Lock is the best and most ingenious of this kind of writing. So why is The Rape of the Lock so perfect as a mock epic text? I want to think about this in relation to ideas about scale, about the relationships between big and small, trivial and important, epic and mock epic. So very briefly, what is the mock epic? Well, here is the title page from the 1714 edition of The Rape of the Lock, and as you can see, Pope himself called the genre the heroic comical, as the term mock epic, which we use today, had not yet been kind of cemented as the designated term for what Pope was actually doing. And the neoclassical period, so the period that Pope was writing in, the new classics, developed techniques that we're going to be thinking about today in terms of techniques that helped develop the mock epic genre. So drawing on the classical period and changing it and developing it for modern times. The term mock epic utilizes both meanings of the word mock. So to mock can mean to imitate, and we might think, for example, of a mock exam. It's a kind of imitation exam. But it also means to deride, scorn, undermine, expose, poke fun at, parody, etc. So the mock epic, imitates the serious, high status genre. In literary culture, the epic obviously is a very high status genre, and the epic form obviously also has its classical authority. And as an aside, Pope draws on both Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid in his own mock epic poem, The Rape of the Lock, but that really is a conversation for another day. Today I'm focused on this kind of double play in the use of the word mock. So it's through the mock epic genre's imitation of the epic that it thus exposes some of the limitations of the epic genre. So what's crucial is how it imitates. So it's the way in which the imitation happens that exposes what it is that's being imitated. It's the mode of imitation. The double meaning of the word mock operates twofold in the Rape of the Lock. On the one hand, the mock epic partially imitates epic in order to expose some of the epic genre's limitations. That epic is so high and lofty, almost sort of abstracted in tone. It is so extracted and removed from real life that epic writing becomes almost sort of metaphysical. But on the other hand, the mock epic exposes, derides, undermines, satirizes the concerns, the lowness of everyday, ordinary human existence. And this is exactly the play that Pope is making in The Rape of the Lock. By yoking together the high and the low, the high appears even higher, sort of absurdly, ridiculously, impossibly high, and the low appears even lower, so trivial, virtually to the point of irrelevance. I want to think about what Pope might consider to be a limitation of the epic genre through his use of scale in his mock epic poem, The Rape of the Lock. So back to Hazlitt, said of the poem, "It is like looking at the world through a microscope, where everything assumes a new character and a new consequence, where things are seen in their minutest circumstances and slightest shades of difference, where the little becomes gigantic, the deformed beautiful, and the beautiful deformed. The wrong end of the magnifier is, to be sure, held to everything, but still the exhibition is highly curious, and we know not whether to be most pleased or surprised." I want to use Hazlitt's insightful idea of thinking of the poem in terms of a microscope. The Rape of the Lock shows things being out of proper proportion. There is an inversion or a confusion of scale. So the little becomes gigantic, the gigantic little, the beautiful deformed, and the deformed beautiful. Hazlitt's reference to the genre of the mock epic in relation to the microscope is really, really useful, I think, in terms of understanding some of the concerns of the neoclassical period more broadly. We can think about the early 18th century interest, when Pope was writing, in the movement between the macro and the micro scale and link it with the development of the microscope. The 17th century had seen the technological development of the microscope. So, for example, first seeing living cells. And you can imagine what a revolution this was in terms of judging what matters and of having your kind of eyes opened to things that previously were obscure and kind of invisible to humans. And Robert Hooke's micrographia, or some physiological descriptions of minute bodies made by magnifying glasses with observations and inquiries thereupon, published in 1665, was a crucial text, and it was one of the first texts to draw and describe items seen through a microscope. And it was incredibly popular, and it radically sort of altered perceptions of the natural world and ideas of scale. And these technological developments in the microscope shifted ideas about perspective, about scale, about big and small, and seeing things really up close for the first time. And that this could be applied also to humans as well, this idea of seeing things through a different lens. And we can see this, for example, so the ways in which the kind of imagery of the microscope affected other writers of the neoclassical period, for example, in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726. So in Voyage 1 and Voyage 2, you've got the Lilliputians and the Brobdingnagians. A really good example, I think, of this shift in perspective is Robert Hooke's illustration of a flea. Something that to the naked eye looks like a completely irrelevant tiny black dot is actually intricate and complex and delicate. In Hazlitt's words, the little has become gigantic, and perhaps even the deformed beautiful. But if not deformed, the notion of scale and perspective and perception was, or is, I think, reformed. And it was almost sort of magical to be able to see something this close up and in this much detail. And I think this is slightly difficult or odd for us to think about now because, you know, at school we're given close-up diagrams of insects and whatever, you know, parts to label. It's fairly familiar to us. But when the microscope first came out and these things were seen for the very first time, it was a really kind of radical change in thinking about the kind of ordering of scale and perspective, and things that humans had kind of easily dismissed sort of take on much more complexity when you see them up this close. But also that enabled then people really to reflect back on humanities. I was talking about Swift in Gulliver's Travels. If we think about the Brobdingnagians, so they're the giant race, and Gulliver, when he's there, is put in the breast pocket of one of the Brobdingnagians, a giantess, and he sees what is effectively human skin kind of through a microscope up very, very close, you know, as close as this flea is here. And you know, he sees the pores and he sees the hair and he sees the sweat and he sees the dirt, and he just comes to see human skin totally differently from how we normally see it, and he's kind of repulsed by it. So these are the concerns that were kind of prevalent in the same period that Pope was writing and thinking about ideas of scale in The Rape of the Lock. Hooke's Micrographia opens by describing a needle. But if viewed with a very good microscope, we may find that the top of a needle, though as to the sense very sharp, appears a broad, blunt, and very irregular end, not resembling a cone as is imagined. So our senses, our touch, and also our sight, to the naked eye at least, tell us that a needle is sharp, but in reality needles are not as sharp as we imagine. So evident in both the observations on fleas and needles, the introduction of the microscope in the 17th century brought with it the big and the small becoming confused, and a mistrust of the senses and what you knew before you had to kind of reevaluate, a playing with perspective. So what seems trivial or insignificant takes on greater size and importance. And Pope plays with ideas of scale in his use of needles and animal imagery in the poem, in The Rape of the Lock. So in the poem, sylphs might be wedged whole ages in a bodkin's eye. So a bodkin is a needle. So one of the characters could be sort of stuck in a needle's eye, so seeing the needle's eye as a kind of prison. And Pope plays with scale here too in terms of time, that the sylph could be trapped for whole ages in a needle's eye. The scale seems a bit off, a bit unusual, a bit absurd. And Pope also describes Belinda's petticoat as stiff with hoops and armed with ribs of whale. Again, readers encounter a confusing sort of impression of size and scale, that Belinda, a human character, is dressed, so the skirt of her petticoat is kind of reinforced with whale ribs. Returning to Hazlitt's idea that the mock epic is where the little becomes gigantic, the gigantic little, and the deformed beautiful, the beautiful deformed. The inversion or confusion of scale is evident in the scenes of battle in which Belinda's feminine beauty equipment, for want of a better phrase, transforms into military equipment. This is an etui case, so an accessories case, from about 1710, which was given to Queen Anne by her chambermaid Abigail Masham. and it contains the essentials, apparently, for an elite woman's life of sewing and grooming. So we've got a gorgeous pair of scissors, and then a knife, which sort of flicks out, a pen, pencil, and a bodkin, a large needle for threading ribbon, pinning hair, and so on. And of course, there is also the beautiful case itself, and one can imagine these items on Belinda's dressing table among the other luxurious objects. These are exquisite, decorative, feminine items as they're cast in the poem, but especially laid as they are in this picture, they could be viewed as weapons. I think the picture on the right almost resembles a kind of tiny quiver of arrows. Belinda's decorative and indeed decorative making equipment, so it is decorative equipment which in turn makes Belinda herself more decorative, is described from the opening canto in militaristic terms. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, now awful beauty puts on all its arms. So the language here in The Rape of the Lock recalls Pope's description of troops preparing for war in his translation of the Iliad. So Pope, during the same period in which he was thinking about and composing and drafting and rewriting The Rape of the Lock, was also translating Homer's Iliad, which was published eventually between 1715 and 1720. So these two kind of texts, the MockEpic and the epic, can be read very much in parallel. But here in Book 8, now had the Grecians, so the Grecian army, snatched a short repast, so they've had a small meal before they go to war, and buckled on their shining arms with haste. So Pope uses exactly the same diction in his translation of the epic poem, the Iliad, as in his mock-epic poem, The Rape of the Lock. The files of shining rows on Belinda's dressing table suggest lines of troops, weapons extended and ready for battle. And this is echoed in the card game, which happens later in Canto 3, when the cards are described as a shining train of troops ready for combat. Beauty puts on its arms, its armour, and prepares for war. That is, Belinda prepares to engage in the social scene with the battle of the sexes that she expects to encounter. And similarly, it is Clarissa's scissors, which Clarissa gives to the Baron, which cut Belinda's hair. And these scissors are described in militaristic terms too. Just then, Clarissa drew with tempting grace a two-edged weapon from her shining case. So women's trivial, tiny beauty items and cards are described on a kind of massive, large military scale, when in fact, I mean, Clarissa's two-edged weapon, those are essentially the scissors that you can see there on the left, you know, really kind of tiny and to cut thread, and yet they're sort of aggrandized into a two-edged weapon on a kind of, as I've said, military scale. So trivial items take on epic proportions. And ultimately in Canto 5, it is these sort of exact items which were foreshadowed as militaristic that Belinda and the other nymphs take up as weapons. So Belinda apprehends the Baron for cutting off her hair and confronts him. And this is an illustration from 1714. "Now meet thy fate," incensed Belinda cried, and drew a deadly bodkin from her side. So in Hazlitt's image, the beautiful has become deformed. The decorative, beautifying accessory has become a weapon of death. It's now a deadly bodkin. And as the Baron lies prostrate on the ground, Belinda demands her lock of hair be returned. "Restore the lock," she cries, and all around, "Restore the lock," the vaulted roofs rebound. And here again, we have a playing with scale. The individual Belinda speaks, and then the universal echo rebounds. Chaos of the fight, the battle between the sexes at the end of the poem, the lock has been transformed into a comet. A sudden star, it shot through liquid air and drew behind a radiant trail of hair. Then cease, bright nymph, to mourn thy ravished hair, which adds new glory to the shining sphere. So something which was deformed in that it was severed from where it was, its form was transformed, is now transformed again into something beautiful and glorious, blazing a trail through the sky for future generations, and amidst the stars inscribed Belinda's name. Again, there is a confusion of scale, the triviality of a lock of hair mixed with the eternal glory of the memorialization of Belinda as a comet. And it's worth thinking more about the ways in which Pope plays with scale. He does it absolutely throughout the poem. He yokes together high and low, gigantic and little, deformed and beautiful, serious and trivial. And it's crucial really to think about why he does this. What is the purpose of Pope's playing with scale in the poem? What has also highlighted in his assessment of The Rape of the Lock is the use of antithesis, which is a very, very Popian literary technique. The word antithesis comes from the Greek opposite placing. So in rhetoric, it means opposing or contrasting ideas in juxtapositional clauses, using opposite or strongly contrasting forms of words. Essentially, antithesis is a kind of mirror image, sort of inversely repeated, reflecting the opposite. It is a technique used famously, for example, by John Milton in his epic poem Paradise Lost, which was originally published in 1667. So these are two examples from Book the First about Satan. The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And another really famous line, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Pope in The Rape of the Lock also uses antithesis, but he uses the form very differently from Milton in the epic poem Paradise Lost. Instead of the kind of grand proclamations of Milton's epic anti-hero, Satan, Pope couches mock-epic anti-heroine. I mean, we can perhaps think of Belinda as an anti-heroine, but that might be a conversation for another day. So Pope couches mock-epic anti-heroine Belinda and her fate in antithetical terms that confuse scale. So in Paradise Lost, heaven and hell, reigning and serving, are on the same scale. They are equal terms. To talk of heaven and hell in the same breath makes sense. There is a balance of proportion there. So essentially we can think of Milton's sort of straightforward, really, use of antithesis in this example here, in that it's a very balanced phrase. To say better to reign in hell than serve in heaven makes sense in terms of proportion, because heaven and hell, serving and reigning, are kind of equitable. If you think of them in terms of a scale, in terms of an old-fashioned scale where you would balance things on either side, you feel that if you put hell on one side and heaven on the other, they would balance out in terms of the weightiness of their importance. But let's see how Pope uses antithesis in The Rape of the Lock. Let's see if Pope really plays with the idea of opposites far more than Milton had done in Paradise Lost. We are told, rather worryingly, that black omens threaten Belinda. This day black omens threat the brightest fair that e'er deserved a watchful spirit's care, some dire disaster, or by force or sleight, but what or where the fates have wrapped in night. So the seriousness of what the fates might have in store for Belinda, the black omens that the fates have wrapped in night, so they've kind of obscured, we can't see them, is played with in the antithetical style of the poem's form. So these are the various things that might happen to Belinda, the fate that might befall her. Whether the nymph shall break Diana's law, or some frail china jar receive a flaw, or stain her honour or her new brocade, forget her prayers or miss a masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball, or whether heaven has doomed that shock must fall. Whether the nymph shall break Diana's law. So Diana, along with being the goddess of hunting, which is interesting in terms of the military combative themes of the poem, was also the goddess of chastity. So if Belinda breaks Diana's law, she will lose her virginity. Or some frail china jar receive a flaw. Alternatively, whether instead of breaking her virginity, she might instead just break a china cup and render it cracked and so flawed. The balance at the end of the two lines and the rhyme of the couplet is telling. To break Diana's law for a young single woman is to receive a flaw. So if she lost her virginity, she would be flawed. Again, in these two lines, we have a conflation here. So a flaw to a china cup, a beautiful, fragile, delicate little china jar, is equated with Belinda's chastity. And readers are kind of encouraged to think whether these things should actually be equated. Or stain her honour or her new brocade. So brocade means material or fabric, so the material of her clothes, the material of her dress. And again, these two things are equated: a stain on your honour and a stain on your clothes. The sort of metaphorical use of staining your honour sort of mixed with the literal staining of her dress, of her material. And Pope uses a Zeugma here, but we'll come back to that a bit later. There's also, though, in this a naughty joke. So it says she would stain her honour, so ruin her reputation by, or the implication is by, that she would ruin her honour by staining her dress. And I think I only need to say here Monica Lewinsky's dress for you to get the drift of that rather naughty joke. But again, we've got a conflation of trivial and important. The material of a dress obviously is trivial, but one's honour, one's reputation, one's standing in the world, one's feeling about oneself is all far more, or one imagines, far more important. Forget her prayers or miss a masquerade. So a masquerade is another word for a ball, a kind of entertainment. So this suggests that Belinda's moral and social life are confused, as earlier in the poem, similarly in Canto 1, we're told that on Belinda's dressing table there are Bibles and billets doux, so love letters, and these paradoxically lie side by side, all jumbled together. So to miss one's nightly prayers, one's vespers, should not be equated with missing a ball, missing a masquerade. But here, through Pope's use of antithesis, they are paralleled. Or lose her heart or necklace at a ball. Similarly, the use of antithesis here allows the poem to suggest that Belinda confuses the external material realm and the internal emotional realm. She might just as easily lose her heart or lose her necklace, and it seems be just as concerned or unconcerned either way. And incidentally, this again is a line of Zeugma, which we'll return to. Finally, or whether heaven has doomed that Shock must fall. That is her lapdog, whose name is Shock, must die. So death is almost kind of casually tacked on at the end here. We've gone through all these things, breaking a cup, staining your dress, etc. And then finally at the end, it might be actually that what fate has in store for Belinda is that her dog dies. So death and heaven do seem to go together in terms of being equal in scale, but it's not Belinda's death that fate might have in store, but her lapdog's. And Belinda doesn't really seem to care that much about her lapdog in the poem. It's much more of a status symbol. But overall, this jumble of possibilities, from cracking a cup to the death of her pet dog, from losing her necklace to staining her honour, suggests that Belinda cannot sort out her priorities, that she confuses what is serious and what is trivial, as indeed does the poem. So I'm now going to look at Zeugma. So another way in which Pope kind of contrasts high and low, serious and trivial, is through his use of Zeugma. So he does this comparison on a kind of grammatical level as well as in terms of the imagery. Zeugma is a literary term for when a single verb governs two or more mutually exclusive nouns. And I think it's much easier to understand if you have an example. So in the line, lose her heart or necklace at a ball, the verb to lose applies equally to both of the two nouns, Belinda's heart and Belinda's necklace. And similarly in or stain her honour or her new brocade, stain applies both, governs both honour and brocade. So the use of Zeugma kind of grammatically yokes together the two separate things and brings them even more sharply into direct contrast with each other. It encourages the reader to ask, is it the same thing to lose your heart and to lose a necklace? Is it the same thing to stain your honour or stain some material? Can they, should they be equated? I now want to look at another example of Zeugma from The Rape of the Lock, which I think articulates very neatly one of the kind of foundational, one of the fundamental ideas about scale that Pope is trying to explore in the poem, in The Rape of the Lock, the relationship between, in kind of everyday human existence, the relationship between the epic, or what we conceive the epic to be, and the trivial, the everyday, the ordinary. And I'm going to do this through the kind of famous use of Zeugma, the Pope's couplet about Queen Anne. Hear thou, great Anna, whom 3 realms obey, dost sometimes counsel take, and sometimes tea. So great Anna is Queen Anne, who was queen when the poem was written and published. The 3 realms who obey her are England, and I'm afraid that Wales at this time is seen as a part of England, and Scotland and Ireland. So the 3 realms, England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland. And the here is Hampton Court Palace, which is a royal but working palace. So it's both a kind of place of work and it's a place of residence for the royal family. And this painting is by James Wingfield, A Summer Afternoon at Hampton Court. It's an anachronistic picture. It's from 1844, so well over a century after The Rape of the Lock was published. But on the back is quoted this couplet from the poem, which I hope helps to show its resonance, its continued resonance and importance for a long time after the poem was published. Dost sometimes counsel take, and sometimes tea. So the fundamentals of the mock-epic genre are invoked in Pope's use of Zeugma here. So one takes counsel or advice, and one takes tea. The two nouns, tea and counsel, are governed by the verb to take. So Anne, as queen, as statesperson, does take counsel at Hampton Court Palace, and this is when Hampton Court Palace is being used for official, royal and national business. So she takes counsel from Britain's statesmen. As the poem highlights, she discusses the fall of foreign tyrants. So in this part, this is the stuff of national and international concern. You know, this is kind of high epic duty. But then at the same time, governed by the Zeugma, the use of the word take, operating on both counsel and tea. So we've got equated there Anne as woman, or in the terms of the poem, a nymph at home. So this is when Hampton Court Palace is in its other guise as a royal residence, or a home. And there, when this woman is at home, she takes tea. And this is a social, a personal, one might say even a trivial affair. So through this use of Zeugma then, that Anne takes both counsel and tea in the same place. So the same person does, this one thing of high epic grandeur and this other kind of trivial thing in the same place. Pope combines the serious, the epic and the trivial in one figure, and perhaps emphasizes the innate mock-epic state of any human action, and indeed the mock-epic state of the human condition generally. In his use of the techniques of antithesis and zeugma then, Pope exposes the human inability to judge scale and perspective, suggesting that humans misjudge and confuse our own importance. We think human life is epic in scale and proportion, when actually it's anything but. Or if the two only serve to undermine each other, on the one hand, Anne is an epic figure doing national important duty, but then at the same time she's also a trivial person who does things like takes tea and whatever else it is that a person does. In the mock epic genre, the triviality of actual human existence is yoked together with epic loftiness to expose humanity's pretensions to grandeur. So, for example, the kind of tiny vanity case treated with militaristic grandeur. The mock epic exposes humanity's self-aggrandizement. We think we're important. We think we're epic heroes. We see ourselves through a microscope. We are the close-up of the flea. Whereas in terms of the scale of the universe, we're a trivial irrelevance, just a tiny black dot that's barely visible. Thank you so much for listening. If you like close reading classic literature, then subscribe to my channel to see more of my weekly videos when they're uploaded. And do ask any questions or post any thoughts that you have in the comments below.